I've called this talk, It's a Science, Just Not This Kind of Science, because I think, genuinely, and this will come as a surprise, it's probably time for the creative community to make friends with science again. And traditionally, if you're a creative person, you've always had this hostility towards the idea that persuasion is a science or that human behavior is a science, largely speaking because your experience of science has been so bad. And it involves people who barely understand what you do beating you up because you can't promise them the same degrees of certainty and mathematical purity that you'd find when you were building a bridge or designing some clockwork or mechanical device. And so by and large, you even get Bernbach's point, this, persuasion is an art, not a science. And, loath as I am to criticize Bernbach, I don't think he's quite right. I think it's a science in the proper sense of the word science, in that it's something which, through learning, can make us better at what we do tomorrow than we were today, which is not a bad definition of a science, that you can simply improve it and make some progress. And I think where it all goes wrong in this weird science-arts divide is actually what happens at school. And what goes wrong at school is you have a particular kind of thing at school which you think of as a science subject. And that's something like maths or physics or chemistry, where what distinguishes a science subject from an art subject at school is that there's a right answer. Okay? So you're set some problem like what is the surface area of a cone, and you basically either get it right or you get it wrong. And it's a completely binary thing. And that's distinguished from an art subject like English or something, where actually, there's a degree of subjectivity in the judgment of your essay, what I did in the summer holidays, or whatever it might have been. And that's actually a false dichotomy and a false distinction. Because actually, in lots and lots of science, particularly really, really sophisticated science, there's a huge appreciation of ambiguity and a huge appreciation of the fact that many, many interventions are both disproportionate and oblique. So what unfortunately happens at school, because everybody at school is taught physics and they're taught chemistry and the basics of mathematics, but they're not taught, for example, social sciences. They're not taught psychology, they're not taught anthropology. This completely false distinction arises where people think science is basically a good thing where you have a right answer and you get a tick, and arts is a kind of vague, fluffy thing where the whole thing is subjective and absolutely unclear. And to some extent, I think that actually infects most of our clients, because they've grown up in a business culture which also makes this completely false distinction. So that if you have a spreadsheet with a number on it, that then becomes in business a decision that's very easy to defend. I did B, not A, because B came out at 7.8, whereas A only came out at 6.4. And therefore, anything which looks scientific has in many cases, I think, unwarranted credibility. It also makes you much less likely to lose your job than making a decision subjectively. And most business people are motivated in business decision making not by actually what is the very best decision, but what is a decision which is easy to sell, easy to justify, and unlikely to get me fired. And that kind of decision making leads to a completely different kind of behavior to the kind of behavior which is actually what is the best decision to take here. And all of you who work with clients will notice there's a fundamental cultural difference between owner-run businesses, where the owner is allowed to be subjective, okay? And shareholder-owned or manager-run businesses, where the person who makes the decision has to report on to somebody else. So if you notice things like, Branson's businesses at their best or Dyson's businesses at their best, those owner-run businesses do highly eccentric, hard to justify, but very, very effective things. So look at it this way. If you remember in the very early days of Virgin Atlantic Airlines, they were the first airline in economy to have films on the seat backs in economy class. And during the film, many of you, this actually is meaningless to most of you who are too young both to remember when economy class seats on long haul didn't have films, but also many of you are too young to remember the chalk ice, I suspect. But in my day, back when music actually had a proper tune and some words, and could be enjoyed without the assistance of drugs, back in my day where actually it was possible to enjoy drugs without actually music without accompanying chemicals, extraordinary period in many ways. There was a thing called a cinema, and in the break you had an interval when you went to the cinema, okay? And someone came along and sold you choc ices. And so, to a Brit of a certain age, the choc ice and the cinema were almost sort of synonymous. You know, now the Americanization means that we have popcorn, which is a ridiculous and disgusting food that no one eats under any other circumstances. But for whatever reason, in our weird urge to be American, we go to the cinema and they say, "Ooh, I know, I will now pay £6 for a bucket of popcorn that's larger than my own child," okay? I don't know why we do this, but for whatever reason, it's just one of these culturally pervasive norms. Actually, that's worthy of scientific investigation. Now, what he did, beautiful little thing in customer experience, when the film started on Virgin Atlantic in economy, the stewardesses and stewards came round and handed out choc ices to all the passengers to help them enjoy the film. In economics, this is called a complementary good. Popcorn and cinema are complementary goods. It's where the consumption of one thing increases the enjoyment and value of the consumption of the accompanying thing. Now, what I'm saying is that Branson at that stage owned the airline outright. Imagine how much easier it is for him to get that decision through than for someone in a conventional shareholder-owned, manager-managed airline. You've got to do an ROI on choc ice dispensing. How the hell do you do that? You know, it's almost impossible. Instinctively, you can tell it's a really bloody good idea. The other problem you have in a manager-run business is that actually everybody with the power to make the choc ices happen is in a position of some seniority with a budget of maybe, you know, 10, 30, 40 million pounds, and saying, "Hey, what about choc ices?" just seems too trivial. You know, it just seems beneath your dignity to say, "Well, I'd just like to interrupt this board meeting, and can we actually pause on the decision about whether we buy Airbuses or Boeing, and whether the engines are powered by the Rolls-Royce Trent or the General Electric BO4793. I'd just like to interrupt you all, and I'd like to talk about choc ices," okay? And yet, to the passenger, they will remember the choc ice for months, weeks, even years after they remember whether the plane was a Boeing or an Airbus, or indeed what the film was, or anything of that kind. So looked at from a human standpoint, what's important to a board and what's a terrifying decision for a board of directors may not be that important a decision to the consumer and to the user. And so this love of science isn't really about making great decisions per se, it's making decisions that also have an element of arse covering. Business has been made worse in this through the invention of the spreadsheet, which has created really in numbers what I call a sort of weird cultish language, which is, it's a bit like Norman French in 12th, I mean the language, not a person called Norman French. I realised that every time I said Norman French, I got loads of people going, "Who the fuck's Norman French?" So it's a bit like French in the Norman period in England in the 12th century, where you don't have to speak it, you can get by with English, but if you want a position of power or influence, you have to speak Norman French. And to some extent, you know, in the business world today, in order to cover your arse and to actually get a hearing, if you haven't got spreadsheet, you don't get very far. So, you know, to some extent, business schools have become language schools where you're taught a peculiar arcane numerical language, which isn't necessarily scientifically valid, by the way. It just makes you look credible and scientific. And be really, really alert to this. That bear in mind that, I'll give you a beautiful instance of this. There are increasing numbers of scientists who believe that human instinctive heuristics, anybody know the word heuristic? Google it on Wikipedia. It is arguably one of the most useful words you can learn. There are a few additions to the vocabulary of marketing which will be really wonderful. Heuristic is one of them. If you could actually ask your clients, what heuristic do people use when choosing in this product, and what is the order in which they deploy heuristics to choose? And quite a few people are arguing that actually the dependence on mathematics leads to kind of insanity. If you think about it, the financial crisis was perpetrated by a bunch of extraordinarily numerate people who had lost the knack of questioning numbers because they'd become sanctified. Now, interestingly, most of us using instinct wouldn't have made the same mistake. There's a very, very common instinct which most of us use every time we make a purchase. Now, if I can't afford to do it, okay, and one day I will do it for real. If I'd staged a stooge outside this building so that when you left, who offered you a brand new Bentley or Rolls Royce or something for 8,000 quid, and he was just standing there, none of you would buy it, right? And the reason you wouldn't buy it is, even though it seems an economically rational thing to do, you all employ all the time a heuristic which basically says if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. All right? Now, arguably, if people in the city had just deployed that heuristic, which is actually there is simply too much money and profit swilling around here for this to be an efficient market. If this were an efficient and properly regulated market, it wouldn't be this easy for banks to make 20% of all the profit in British industry over a period of 5 or 6 years. This is patently not right. It feels instinctively wrong. Basically, stop. But nobody was allowed to use their instincts. They were forced to use spreadsheets which weren't alert to exactly that problem. But the point is about making this distinction about science is that our clients, I think, are guilty of this. They think that scientific means there is a single right answer. Why is that wrong? Well, actually, it's wrong because, and people have been making this point actually, Dr. Johnson made this point in a response to Adam Smith in the 18th century. More recently, Hayek, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, made this whole criticism of economics, which he says, the reason we haven't made any progress in economics is because we've tried to imitate the physical sciences. If you're calculating the orbital path of a planet, or you want to calculate the relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume, you can do that using exact mathematical formulae because it's a simple system, okay? To deploy and attempt to imitate that kind of mathematical certainty in an economy is fundamentally a category error. It's just wrong. Just to be clear about this, by the way, about what complexity means, you can't actually solve chess mathematically. The way that chess-playing computers play chess is through heuristics and pattern recognition. They play it a bit like humans play chess, only faster. They do not play it by calculating every probable outcome of a game 8, 10, 15 moves ahead and working out what statistically is the best move. First of all, it's unknowable because you don't know what your opponent's going to do. So unless you understand the complete workings of your opponent's brain, it's impossible to be perfect in any case. Really good chess players know the opposition and study the opposition's style of play. The second thing is that it's basically intractable. If you want to work out the probabilistic best move, 10, 12, 15 moves ahead in chess, then actually the number of possibilities becomes so great that it's kind of close to the number of atoms in the universe. And actually it would take the world's greatest supercomputer something like 1 billion years to calculate the outcome using rational mathematical probability. Just to give you an idea of how big numbers become when you add degrees of choice, do you know how many possible coffees you can order at Starbucks? And I'm not including really weird ones where you mix one flavouring with another flavouring, or you ask for half decaf, half regular. The number of possibilities is 80,000, by the way. Just because you can choose, ordinary coffee, decaf coffee, some other kind of coffee, different kinds of milk, different kinds of frothing, different kinds of flavouring. Once you multiply it up over 3 or 4 things, you actually have a choice of 80,000 different items, different coffees at Starbucks. My suspicion is that probably about 70% of people buy one of about 9, but nonetheless, that's where the probability goes. Interestingly, how, in 2001, the film 2001, it isn't one letter in front of IBM, as is often believed. As Kubrick explained, he said IBM had helped us a lot with the making of the film by providing technology and so forth. So he said the last thing I was going to do is actually take the piss out of them in the film. HAL stands for heuristically programmed algorithmic computer. And it understands that actually in order to deal with complex systems like meteorology or chess, you need heuristics, you can't use pure mathematics. So the idea of a right rational answer where one single move is provably better than any other is simply impossible. Just to give you another point about how complex systems, Karl Popper made the point, he said, that in the world everything lies on a spectrum between clouds and clocks. Complex systems are clouds, that's meteorology, where it's impossible to predict the weather more than a few days in advance, simply because the computing power simply cannot exist. Clocks are things like bridge building and mathematical certainty. Popper goes on to say that the worst mistakes in human decision-making are made by people who treat clouds as if they're clocks. So attempting purity of rational argument in something like human behavior or mass behavior change is simply a wrong aspiration, okay? And that's treating a cloud as if it's a clock. And so this idea that we should try and make what we do look like schoolboy science is completely dangerous and wrong. On the other hand, there are loads and loads of sciences there which deal with complexity. The more advanced forms of economics, game theory, arguably meteorological modelling, which might be of huge use to us. It's just a different kind of science. And Hayek's point was, by making economics try and imitate what you might call the science of working out the surface area of a cone, you fundamentally misrepresent human behaviour. And in order to do it, economists make absurd and dangerous assumptions about how humans behave. That, for example, that we all make decisions in isolation, individually, uninfluenced by the behaviour of other people. Now, anybody who understands even the smallest thing about the fashion industry knows that actually we are hugely influenced by the behaviour of other people, because we ourselves do not choose what is fashionable. We have to work within an existing and dynamic environment of what other people wear. There is a small argument which says that actually there are one or two people in the world who can simply decree something fashionable. There's a woman in the luxury goods industry who says basically if Kate Moss does it, it's cool. Okay? But most of us, you know, I could theoretically choose, for reasons of my own comfort, to spend my entire life wearing, say, 16th century French court costume, okay? But it would be extraordinarily difficult for me to do so, because one, I wouldn't be known as anybody, and I'd be known as that twat in the, you know, in the buckle shoes, okay? Secondly, you know, every time you met anybody, you would have to explain why you're wearing this ridiculous clothing. The fact that contagion, that behaviours actually spread horizontally, they aren't actually decided individually, is something that classical economics is in denial about, simply because it makes it too mathematically complicated. Just an interesting touch, by the way, contagion is very, very powerful. I've got an Android tablet, which anybody else here, I actually prefer it to the iPad. That's probably in a creative group. That's complete bloody heresy, is it? Am I going to be stoned afterwards? Okay. But actually, the new Nexus, the new Google Nexus, 7-inch Nexus tablet, is absolutely gorgeous thing. It's only 200 quid, and it's absolutely lovely. But the worst thing about owning an Android tablet is every time you take it out, someone says, so why didn't you buy an iPad? And you know, social pressure is actually very, very strong. This is a device, the electronic cigarette, which, according to some scientists, if everybody who smoked in the United States just took up e-smoking, okay, or vaping, because it's a vapor, not a smoke, it would reduce the number of tobacco-related deaths in the United States by 2 orders of magnitude, from 500,000 a year to 5,000. Now, that's a holocaust about every 8 years. That's a pretty, I mean, they're older people, in fairness. I mean, let's make a distinction, okay? But that's a pretty significant number of people to, you know, save from illness. The problem isn't the technology. The problem is that it's embarrassing to use these for most people in public. So it may actually be your social duty to go around as cool people, e-smoking all over the place, even if you don't smoke, okay? Just to help other people pick up the habit. You're saving lives. So I'll just, no pressure then, okay? Right? Now the second thing is, you know, the second thing is interesting, which is one of the reasons these things don't take off. Admittedly, the absolute final scientific verdict on them is not yet in. But most intelligence people say it's hardly likely to be worse than a cigarette. But the second problem, of course, is that simply through laziness over the years, people have got the idea that nicotine is what gives you cancer and what's bad for you. And so they go, well, a device that gives you nicotine is going to be just as bad for you as smoking. The reality of the matter requires exactly what you do as creative people, which is reframing something. And actually, nicotine as a drug is basically, it has some beneficial effects. It wards off Alzheimer's, apparently. So take up smoking in later life if you haven't done it already. But the other thing is, it's about on a par with caffeine. Okay? It's the delivery mechanism of the cigarette that's disastrous in health terms, not the nicotine. But most people don't know that, so they go, what's the point of switching from one nicotine delivery device to another? Kind of interesting. Frames, how we see the world is kind of arbitrary in many respects. It's hugely important. So, you know, I think there should be a ministry of reframing. The whole property crisis was caused by framing, which is a perceptual issue. Every single time, who was partly responsible for the financial crisis and the property boom? I would say not advertising, it was actually television companies and television news. Every single time the property market went up, it was announced on the news as if it was good news. Now, hold on a second. Nobody says, great news for everybody who's got half a tank of petrol in their car, petrol prices are going up. Property is a cost of living, and particularly for your generation, what this was, by saying great news, property prices have gone up, it was basically people aged 50 and above who already owned loads of property, laughing at people aged 20 who hadn't yet bought one and now will never be able to afford to buy one. Okay? But that was the frame of reference. So property was positioned not as consumption, but as investment. And buying property was seen as inherently worthy. And then the BBC added to this with loads of programmes about property porn, which basically suggested that the highest end of life, that greater than religion, truth, beauty, was to put out some decking and then maybe put little bits of driftwood going up your wall, okay? So framing how we view the world has a much greater import on our behaviour than actually objective reality. And frames of reference can be very, very dangerous, because if you have a collective delusion about something like property market, it leads to collective insanity. And so the point I'm making here about science is that that urge, which you tend not to find among owner-run businesses, where the person actually realizes or is free to actually make whimsical decisions, that need to justify decisions actually makes business worse, because it means that people do what is measurable rather than what's important. It also means they concentrate too much of their time on doing big things. I don't know if you've seen my TED talk, Sweat the Small Stuff. One of the characteristics of simple systems, like a bridge or a lever, is by and large, the bigger the input, the bigger the effect. It's highly proportionate. Complex systems aren't like that at all. Okay? Complex systems are like butterfly. You all know about the butterfly effect, don't you? A butterfly flapping its wings in Latin America can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world in 6 days' time. In many cases, in complex systems, and human psychology is patently complex, and mass human psychology is very, very complex, actually there isn't so great a link. There's a correlation, but not that great a link between scale of intervention, scale of effect. And so Ogilvy change, as our behavioural change practice, has as its motto, little ideas from big thinkers. We aim to solve solutions with the smallest interventions possible. We also have an interesting phrase, which is dare to be trivial. We think little ideas like the chalk ice effect are absolutely brilliant and are hugely undervalued simply because they don't seem, inverted commas, strategic. Okay? But economics, I'll tell you this in a second, so I don't need to, so be careful about ROI. This requirement to make marketing accountable, and the fact that marketers go along with it, is basically like the Stockholm syndrome. It's where you adopt the characteristics of your abusers and your abductors. And it's marketing people, instead of fighting back and saying, you're committing a category error, the thing we do does not allow for simple mathematical modelling, which we should be saying. And if we made friends with good scientists, that's what we'd say, okay? We'd fight back. Instead we go, yes, you're absolutely right, all marketing must be accountable, right? So, one point is, if you try and work out the value of a brand to a company, let's think of what a brand does. For good or ill, it affects who you sell to, what you can sell, how much you can sell for, to whom, how frequently they buy. Okay? It affects all those things, right? It also affects your ability to do R&D. If you have a strong brand, you can innovate and brand stretch into different adjoining categories or completely unrelated categories like Caterpillar. Okay? If you have a weak brand, you can't do that. Thirdly, it affects who comes to work for your company, how much you have to pay them, how long they stay for you, and it affects the way they behave in the office. A brand affects that. And it also affects other things which may be hugely important, though seemingly trivial, which is when your chief executive has to ring up a government minister or a competitor to ask for a favour, it affects whether the bugger picks up the phone. Trust me, if you're the Minister of Aviation, there's a big difference between I've got a call in from British Airways and someone from Ryanair is on the line. Okay? Right? Now, if a brand, which I believe affects all those things, how can you possibly calculate the actual numerical value of that brand? There are two possibilities. Either you're the world's greatest mathematician or you're a bit of an idiot. But at some point what we have to say is this stuff is mathematically intractable, and attempts to sort of impose certainty on it are actually highly fallacious. The other point about ROI is I'm very interested in customer experience. Now, customer experience, the first thing you need to understand about human behavior is that people aren't calculators. When they buy things, when you choose a car, very few people, and only frankly the direst and most boring and tedious people, choose a car by looking at long ranks of statistics about its acceleration, its maximum speed, its fuel economy, its cost of depreciation. Only very dull people do that. There's a name for the people, by the way, which is brilliantly coined by someone in the photography industry, measure-baiters. And measurebation is the practice of obsessing about the numerical value to the expense of anything else. Great book by a guy called Matt Watkinson on experience design and customer experience, which is coming out in about a week's time. Pre-order it from Amazon, okay, guys? 10 Principles of Good Customer Experience. Very, very interesting book. And he mentions this thing about measurebation, which is that measurebaters in the photography industry are people who know everything about the camera, the number of megapixels, the build of the CMOS, the software that's used for compression, the speed of rendering or compression, focal length, this, that, and the other, and they obsess about which qualities their digital camera has. And there's one other quality of measurebaters, by the way. They take shit photographs, okay? Because they're not really interested in photography, they're interested in cameras. And a large number of people who are desperate for mathematical certainty are basically measure-baiters in business. But the other thing is that most consumers aren't measure-baiters. They choose using a mixture of heuristics, proxies. A brand is a very intelligent proxy, because a brand is a piece of data compression that compresses lots of data about the quality of the product, the word of mouth of the product. Brands already include social proof in them. How long the product and company's been in operation, what its reputation generally is. Fame is not an appalling heuristic for reliability. Why? If you have a very valuable reputation, think of it in game theory terms. Why do we pay a premium for a reputation? Partly it may be badge value, I'm not disputing that, but there's a game theoretic reason for that, which is if you buy from someone with a reputation, they have much more to lose from ripping you off. Okay? So it may not be that actually what they produce is better, but it's much less likely to be shit. And so we often misunderstand that. We think that purchase behavior is dominated by what is the best. It isn't. It's very largely, if you look at prospect theory and you look at loss aversion in behavioral economics, the prime human motivation, the instinctive subconscious motivation for most purchases, not what you talk about in market research, by the way, because it's instinctive, is basically, can I make this purchase with a feeling of confidence? In other words, is it unlikely to be shit? And when you understand that, it's called satisficing as distinct from maximizing, you realize why McDonald's is so successful. Because everybody disses McDonald's in rational conversation, okay? Because let's be fair about it, there are very few towns in the world where McDonald's is the best restaurant in town. But all credit to McDonald's, it's never shit, okay? So I've had stomach upsets and ended up spending my afternoon vomiting and crapping my guts out after eating at Michelin-starred restaurants. Okay, I've never been ill at McDonald's, ever. Fair? Has anybody else ever had food poisoning at McDonald's? Considering how many people eat there, that's a pretty extraordinary achievement. Okay, the loos are never unclean. I'm never ripped off. I know exactly what the food is, so I'm not disappointed. You may not like it, but you're not disappointed. Well, I've been to fancy restaurants where you suddenly realise that what you ordered is actually the French for cow's testicles or something, and you spend 4 hours and 100 quid basically sitting there going, yuck, and almost, forcing yourself not to retch. So first of all, if you understand that, and fame is, in game theoretic terms, it's a very good assurance. If someone is reputationally fragile through being famous, it costs them much more to sell a bad product than someone anonymous and non-famous. Do you understand what I'm saying here? That actually, if you're buying a second-hand car, imagine two scenarios. You can buy a second-hand car from someone who's known your dad for 7 years and who drinks in the same pub as your dad, okay? And he lives in a house not far from your dad, all right? Now, you can buy that second-hand car. That guy could have filled the gearbox with sawdust. But if he's done that, he has quite a big reputational bit of damage. He takes a reputational hit because he's got to face your dad, the other people in the pub, and accept them all knowing that he's basically ripped off this kid who's just bought a car, who's a son of a friend of his, okay? Equally, you buy the same looking second-hand car for £50 less from a bloke called Dave who lives 200 miles away, and all you have is his mobile phone number, probably for a pay-as-you-go mobile phone. Okay? How confident do you feel then? Would you pay more to buy the car from your dad's friend, or from the guy called Dave? I think you'd pay more. Fair? Because as a game theorist, it makes sense. You look, the mafia, by the way, one of the reasons mafia are family and they have all these mechanisms, it's another way of doing it, with the threat of violence rather than the threat of reputational damage. But that's where you use family linkages and basic sort of, a different form of game theory to police markets. Also, someone who's famous is patently in business for the long term. Someone you've never heard of, maybe just trying to make a one-off hit. In game theory, the one-off hit is totally different from the repeat game. The strategy you play in a repeat game is you do a good job by your customers so they come back. If you're just trying to make a quick buck, you make as much money from the bastards as you can and you don't care what the after-sales effect is. Got it? So actually spending money up front on advertising, branding and fame is proof of long-term intention. The engagement ring, by the way, is a game theoretic device. It's upfront expense, which is proof of long-term intention. Now, most women don't say that. They go, ooh, it's beautiful. But instinctively, they know that. Engagement rings, if you think about it, you're patently in this intending to be in it for the long run if you buy an engagement ring. How else can a month's salary last a lifetime, was De Beers' line. Well, possibly the best advertising framing line of all time. Because nobody knew what to spend on an engagement ring, and they told you a month's salary. I think most blokes go, after tax. But I mean, but what an absolutely genius piece of framing. I mean, that was done by, I think Ayer was the agency. I think it's one of the cleverest ad lines of all time, because it basically says, hey girls, if he doesn't spend a month's salary, he's a cheapskate, okay? There's another reason, by the way, women particularly like being bought jewellery and flowers. Does anybody know this? It's precisely because men don't like jewellery or flowers. So when you buy a woman jewellery or flowers, you're spending your money on something that she likes with absolutely, which is basically sacrificial expenditure. Because you're buying something which leaves you completely cold, okay, in order to make the girl happy. Because blokes don't get off on jewellery. Lingerie maybe, not jewellery, right? Okay? Okay? Now, so if you buy jewellery, it's patently a sacrificial, generous act. Whereas if you buy your wife a radio-controlled helicopter for her birthday, there is a strong suspicion of self-interest, okay? So understanding the brain as a game theorist puts a completely new complexion on how advertising works. And to some extent, a brand is actually an exposed vulnerability. It says, this will confer an advantage on me for as long as I live up to it, but if I actually disappoint, the brand will actually hurt me much more. Having a brand will actually hurt me much more. So reputation, there's a whole load of areas of this which you can only understand. You can't understand using economics. You have to understand game theory. I mean, there are some unattractive things, by the way, which emerge from this, which, oh God, I'm being filmed, I won't tell you. Okay, but one of the problems with ROI is, because consumers are game theorists, when they judge customer service, they tend to judge things particularly favourably which don't make money. And a client of mine at British Airways was in mufti. He wasn't wearing, well, he's in marketing, so he doesn't wear uniform anyway. But he was at Heathrow at Terminal 5 with his family, and you know what happens on those trolleys? All the luggage falls off, because they now make luggage in a slidey plastic format, so you can't really stack it. Design industry, take note. Actually adding a little bit of friction to luggage might be a good idea, but anyway, there we go. Okay? Now, what happened was all his luggage fell over, and from about 100 yards away, someone else from British Airways, I think a steward, came over and helped him and his wife pick it up. He said what was cool about that was the guy didn't have to do that. He wasn't even on duty, he just happened to be at the airport. Whereas things you have to do or things you make money from are judged, that's like giving your wife a radio-controlled helicopter. It's seen as self-interested, okay? Whereas things that are sacrificial, we really appreciate. You've got that diamond ring, flowers, sacrificial. Lingerie, bit of self-interest there. Hoover, no, definitely not. Got it? Okay? Radio-controlled helicopter might be fun, but let's be frank, you did it for you, not for me. Got it? So when you apply ROI to customer experience, it gets very dangerous, because you end up doing the very things that make people cynical about you, and you never do the things that make people go, wow. And by the way, that is why nobody in the world will ever say, I'm glad my boyfriend bought me an expensive engagement ring because it's proof of his long-term intentions, okay? Because we don't say it because it's instinctive. We know it. I'm sorry to posit such cynical motivations and thoughts to people in this case. It's kind of true. Okay? And if you look at weddings, okay, what weddings are is a commitment testing device. It's basically testing the Y chromosome to destruction, which is you contrive a 6-month period where you put a man through everything, assuming he's heterosexual, okay? You put a man through everything he hates most in the entire world. Table plans, floral arrangements, going to dress designers, having your shoes dyed, spending sort of £70 on or £200 on printing some invitations when frankly you could just text all your mates, okay? And the whole reason why everything to do with weddings is so insanely expensive is precisely that, because it's symbolic game theoretic expense. And it's very clever testing for men, because if a bloke can put up with you through that shit, he's probably going to stick around for another 8 or 10 years to look after the kids. Okay? That's why weddings are specifically designed to be everything that women love and everything that men really, really hate. Women say that men are afraid of commitment. Absolute bullshit. We like being married. We just can't stand the idea of a wedding. Okay? If you redesigned a wedding as a bloke wedding, which would be basically an evening getting pissed, a weekend quad biking with some mates, and then a brief ceremony where all your friends buy you high-end consumer electronics. There'd be blokes all over the world going, I'm desperate to get bloody married, but she's just afraid of commitment, okay? All right? Trust me, the wedding is basically designed as the big hurdle, which is if you can put up with that shite, he'll probably put up with all your other foibles as well, okay? It's taking the Y chromosome and basically stress testing it to hell. Because be honest about it, does any bloke like that shit? I mean, it's sheer mental torture, isn't it? You like that stuff? No, fine, okay. Okay, now. Okay, so let me give you a nice example of a beautiful idea I only saw a few days ago. This is the British Gas mobile iPhone app for reading your meter. Nice little scrolly things, but that's Steve Jobs' work, okay? Now, somebody designing that app just said, well, hold on, most people's electricity and gas meters are like in a cupboard somewhere and it's full of spiders and it's dark and kind of shitty. So they added this, a little switch where you click on and it turns on the light on your iPhone to turn your iPhone into a torch so you can read the meter. Okay? Now, does anybody agree that's like, frankly, that's Leonardo da Vinci, that's flaming art, that is? To sync that intelligence. But what's the ROI on that? Well, the only ROI I can say is emotional return on investment. The 6 people who discover that and find it useful will then actually, for the next day, the best experience of their life will be one delivered by a gas utility. How often do you get the chance as a gas company to do that? You know, other than rescuing people from a burning building, it's pretty difficult. That is utterly fantastic. But if someone asks what's the ROI, it's impossible. The very fact that it doesn't have an ROI is what makes it brilliant. And that's the problem about cynical ROI approaches to all marketing activity. Oh God, I'm being filmed again. I tried this experiment with my wife, okay? I do not try this at home, okay? But I bought some flowers from the station, quite nice. That was romantic, because normally blokes will buy flowers from a petrol station, but these were actually bought, you know, like as genuine flowers. And I gave my wife the flowers, and just because I'm obsessed with behavioural psychology and game theory, as I handed them over, I said, if you agree to have sex with me tonight, you can have these flowers. Okay. Barely didn't speak to me for about 48 hours. It was only an experiment. I tried to explain, you know. You wouldn't listen, okay? If you think about it, once you make the thing nakedly self-interested, all the magic is destroyed. And so much of consumer capitalism has become nakedly transactional, it actually loses its actual value. Everything Amazon sells you is always trying to sell you something. No, do something that actually is completely generous and people really notice. Here's just a few very quick things. I've got a few moments left, okay? This is Schumpeter, this is Peter Drucker. There are only 2 things that make money for a company, marketing and innovation. Everything else is a cost. And I'd say that marketing and innovation are essentially the same thing. And you're going to go, those 2 things are too brave for marketers to say. I disagree. Let me explain. Drucker, who wrote that line, his dad's best friend and one of his good friends was the economist Schumpeter, who is not one of the naughty economists who pretends that everybody decides individually, that we maximize our own individual utility, that mass behavior is individual preference expressed in aggregate. A load of assumptions that are total rubbish and extraordinarily damaging to business, by the way. He was an Austrian school. Anybody heard of Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, Schumpeter? They're all Austrian, okay? They're all, I mean, actually, those 3 are all Austrian in origin, but they're also American-Austrian school economists. What distinguishes the Austrian School of Economics is that I don't know whether they're right or wrong about everything, but they're right about one big thing. They believe that economics as a discipline should be a subdivision of psychology. They believe there's a science called praxeology, which is the study of human action and decision-making. which you might almost call behavioral economics, or anthropology or social science. Praxeology is the study of human action and behavior, and economics is merely the study of that behavior under conditions of scarcity. Now, that is actually a remarkable thing, because the interesting thing is that as a result of believing that, first of all, and secondly, believing that all value can only be defined subjectively, that something has no objective value, it is simply worth what people are prepared to pay for it, then interestingly, the Austrians believe that marketing is no lesser a creator of value than, for example, manufacturing. You're going to go, that's weird, right? Ludwig von Mises, quote from Uncle Ludwig, okay, there is no sensible distinction to be made between the value a restaurant creates by cooking food and the value a restaurant creates by sweeping the floor. One of them provides, the primary good, the food, and the other one creates the environment and context in which that food can be most appreciated, enjoyed, and respected. But the two are indistinguishable. It's a nonsense to say that that's absolute value, and the marketing role, sweeping the floor, creating the frame, doing the advertising, is somehow secondary. Do you get that? So actually the distinction between the real product and then marketing just adds a little bit of fancy magic dust to the top is a completely false distinction. In fact, you could also say that marketing and innovation are the same thing because of this. Let me explain. There are only two ways you can actually usefully innovate or disrupt economies by what Schumpeter would call sort of entrepreneurial activities of invention. One of them is to work out what people want and to find out a clever way of making it. And the other way is to find out something you can make and work out a way to make people want it. They're the same thing, okay? There's absolutely no difference between those two. And so we tend to think of ourselves as marketers, as secondary, and the worst offender of that is James Dyson. Is this going on the web? Tough. Okay? Dyson is an engineer who believes that the simple reason people pay £170 for his vacuum cleaners is because they're superior examples of engineering. They are very good pieces of engineering, although I would argue that baglessness is actually a disadvantage, because every time you try and empty the vacuum cleaner, half of the shit goes back on the floor again. Particularly as people who own a Dyson also have one of those sort of knob-ended American bins, which only open at the side. True? How many of you admit it? Come on, own up. Okay? Now, but Dyson absolutely despises marketing. But the fact is that, engineering aside, if Dyson had done all those brilliant things and put them in a plain, non-transparent, beige plastic cover, no one would have bought those things at all. Okay? And yet he disparages marketing and attributes all the success of his machines not to design but to engineering. Oh, that's total bullshit, okay? So what we need to do is end this false dichotomy between psychology. Now, this is now my biggest assertion of the day. I've got about 4 minutes left. And my biggest assertion of the day is that the next revolution, here's the bottom one, advances in psychology, therefore, once you accept that Austrian premise, okay? Important thing about the Austrians, by the way, if you criticize free market capitalism as currently practiced, people in business tend not to listen to you because they assume you're a bit of a pinko and all you want to do is basically, redistribute wealth. Actually, the Austrians are actually libertarian right-wing nut jobs in many respects, okay? So you can actually absolve yourself of the accusation of but they're very, very marketing friendly, so they're okay by me, frankly. Pure self-interest. But if this is true, we assume technology and marketing, technological innovation, marketing innovation are the same thing. That means that we're assuming the next big thing after the internet is going to be technology. It's going to be flying cars. It's going to be 3D printing. What if it isn't? What if the next big thing is advances in psychology instead? If we can simply understand better and more accurately what people want, then we can massively reduce the wasted effort in failed attempts to find out what it is. So in terms of creating economic value, an advance in psychology could be every bit as economically important to both the quality of human life and to the general wealth of countries as an advance in technology. So just bear that in mind. And actually, funnily enough, they may be linked, that computer modeling may actually make possible better models of mass human behavior. So for a few little reading lists to end with, read a bit about classical economics. This is a book, he's an Austrian, Tyler, actually, but he writes about fairly standard economics. It's worth reading because two things. One, some of the models in Austrian economics are useful. In classical economics are useful. All models are wrong, but some of them are useful. Second thing is that You'll learn a useful vocabulary. Marketing has the worst vocabulary in the world. As a friend of mine said, it's like the vocabulary of astrology. If you're talking to fellow believers, it's all fine, everybody nods along. You know, oh, I know, my boyfriend left me. Yes, typical Capricorn, you know. Now, if you believe in astrology, I'm not knocking you, by the way. If you believe in astrology, you'll nod along and go, yeah, I know, Capricorn, terrible, aren't they? Born on the cusp, right? But if you don't believe in astrology, that person will basically sound like a complete nut job. Okay? And marketing's like that. If you're talking to other marketers, we all sound fine. If we talk to anybody else, we sound like a whack job. My brother knows this. He's an astronomer. The worst thing that ever happened to him before he got married is you go to a party, a girl would say, so what do you do then? She'd go, I'm an astronomer. He's building an infrared telescope in the Atacama Desert in Chile. See? Girl goes, you're an astronomer. That's brilliant. I'm a Sagittarius. Oh, shit. You know, this isn't going to go anywhere. And going to a finance guy or a CEO or someone outside marketing and talking about brand iconography is like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington and saying, we must trust to the healing value of the crystal. Okay? It's that fucking mad. So learn the vocabulary of this, and this is a great book, and it's fun to read, and it's funny, and you'll have better ideas, okay? Read, by the way, Tim Harford, some of his books, The Logic of Life. I think Tim Harford's actually being converted to the Austrian cause. That's just my suspicion. Then read a bit of behavioural economics. Anybody read Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational, Nudge, Thinking Fast and Slow? They're all fun to read, actually. They're also all really useful to you, even if you never deploy it in business, which you should. They're really useful to you in your personal life. Sunk cost bias, anybody know about this? I had probably one of the best, the earliest applications of understanding behavioural economics is understanding sunk cost bias. My wife and I had booked non-refundable tickets to go to Paris for the weekend. And they're about 80 quid each or something. And then on the Friday we were due to go, both of us woke up with just appalling colds and flu, man flu or whatever it's called. We just both felt shit. But because we bought the tickets, we were determined to go. And I would have gone, and I would have basically spent another 400 quid on hotels and restaurants and art galleries in order to feel shit in hotels, restaurants and art galleries. There's nothing worse than being ill away from home, by the way, is there, really? It really is horrible. And I just read this article and I said, hold on, we're suffering from sunk cost bias here. If we hadn't bought these tickets, we wouldn't dream of going to Paris this weekend because we feel shit. The fact that we have bought the tickets is something we can do nothing about, so it shouldn't affect our decision. I took the tickets, ripped them up and chucked them in the bin. I then had to retrieve them because you could get the tax back occasionally, apparently. But okay. But the point was, I was about to spend... The £80 each was not, I had no control over that anymore, that was gone, and I was about to spend another £400 in order to feel shit somewhere else. What we did is rip the tickets up, spent the weekend wrapped in a duvet, because this was before the invention of the slanket, unfortunately, or indeed the onesie. Has anybody, what's going on with that? I mean, you young people, you're just mad, basically. Does anybody own a onesie who'll admit to it? Come on. I got to know. Nobody? Okay, interesting. Okay, but before the invention of the onesie and the slanket, you had to wrap yourself in a duvet. We overdosed on Lemsip and watched crap on the television. Actually had quite a nice weekend and saved 400 quid. So it can be useful in your own life. Read about this. The third thing you need to know about, and I end on this if you're okay, is just this. I'll just show you this film. Because another science we ought to know a bit more about is called psychophysics. So have a watch of this. Oh, sorry, it's jumped forward, is it? Why did it do that? Here we go. Let's try. I'll press play again. Are you all right? Yeah, crank the volume up to max.
We are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Has anybody seen this before?
Look at this. What do you hear? But look what happens when we change the picture. And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing bar with a B. It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect. Take another look. Concentrate first on the right of the screen. Now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the group effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear.
Now, all you need to know to work in advertising, in design, or anything else, I'll be very quick, is basically psychophysics, which is perception and objective reality correlate very badly indeed. The brain, before anything reaches our conscious perception, performs a massive amount of data compression. It also performs a massive amount of error correction, getting rid of ambiguity, in order to construct a simple narrative from the insane quantity of data available. Nearly all of this happens at the unconscious level. So, just one other psychophysics experiment. There's a square marked A and a square marked B. The square marked A is darker. All agreed? It's a dark square. The square marked B is a light square. In reality, they're exactly the same color. Now, you can't do anything about it. It's not one of those optical illusions where you go, silly me, I should have seen it the first time, now I see it. If I go back to that again, it's impossible for you to see that as other than the dark square. Actually, about 1% of people or less do see them as the... Anybody here?
They're the same.
They're A and B are the same color. No, this is absolutely true. Psychophysics basically means that our perception of temperature is, first of all, highly relative. Our perception of color, shade, people with perfect pitch are one tiny exception, okay? But nearly everybody else perceives things relatively, a bit higher, a lot higher. It's also leaky. Loudness and pitch get confused in our head very, very quickly, okay? And unconsciously. Now, what the McGurk effect shows is that actually designing things, if you believe that value is subjective, designing things using objective measures is totally stupid. But that's how all business aspires to do it, because it's obsessed with measurebation. If you ask a business person to work out how to improve queuing at Heathrow Airport, they'll measure the duration of the average queue and try and bring that length down. But the actual truth of the matter is the perception of a queue has very little to do with duration. It's actually got to do with a few other things. You need to understand, first of all, if you keep moving constantly, it's much less painful than if you come to a stop. Disney has done a load of research into this. If you put little signs saying 4 minutes to go, 3 minutes to go, which are a clear marker of progress, people feel much better about it. The third thing is a queuing system has to be fair. If you have two parallel EasyJet check-in queues and the other one is just going faster than yours, people go absolutely insane and hate queuing. So duration actually is not the biggest determinant of queuing frustration and pain. I always end up at EasyJet, I go, oh, that queue looks a bit shorter than that one, and then I discover I'm basically 3 steps behind someone with an out-of-date Estonian passport who wants to check in a fucking euphonium. You know, that's my kind of luck. And I'm sitting there going, oh, for fuck. Do you know what it is? Old people, but the other thing is about a good queue, it should have no old people in it. I mean, if you queue for a station, you're going to a job interview in the morning and you're queuing at the station to buy your ticket, and the woman in front of you at the ticket counter is actually saying, well, I was thinking of going to Great Yarmouth on Thursday. And actually all your instincts to be nice to old people vanish at this point, and you become a very nasty person indeed. Another interesting, by the way, now I'll skip that one, I really haven't got time, have I? No. Okay, but any good designer or advertising person is a psychophysicist. They translate objective measures into measures people care about. And that's where I talk about the final example where engineering dominated and psychophysics didn't have a say, which is of course the Eurostar. £6 billion to produce a 35 minutes or 40-minute reduction in journey time between Paris and London. Don't get me wrong, duration isn't totally irrelevant, but it's not linear. Our perception of duration is very bad anyway. When you're playing Angry Birds, time has no meaning, for example. Anybody play Sprinkle, by the way? Nobody? Okay, I think it's 159, iPhone and iPad app, utterly brilliant. Okay, Sprinkle it's called, just a tip, just because you're all from competing agencies, so I want to waste as much of your time as possible. Okay. There was a theory that Tetris was invented by the Soviets to bring down Western capitalism. I don't know. But anyway, but Sprinkle, remember that? Okay. Now, the point is that time isn't that. Now, don't get me wrong. If you can get it down from 8 hours to 3, it makes a big difference. Remember, this is a relativistic thing. You've got to compete with the airlines. Okay. Now, actually, that isn't that big a difference. People prefer going by train, by and large, than they do going by plane for short-haul journeys because there's less dicking around. So you'd already won that battle. You could have spent 1% of the money and just said, okay, we'll put Wi-Fi on the trains. It would have made more of a difference to people's preference of how to travel than if you'd actually sped the journey up at a cost of £6 billion. As I jokingly said, you could have spent £1 billion, banked £5 billion and returned it to the taxpayer and just employed all of the world's top male and female supermodels to walk up and down the train as handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'd have saved yourself £5 billion and people would ask for the trains to slow down. But duration, the idea that faster is better, is rubbish. Flying to Hong Kong or flying to Los Angeles is actually, or flying back from Los Angeles is actually better than flying back from Boston because you get a proper night's sleep. And the final point is that you are as much involved in the value creation business if you change perceptual frames or if you change psychophysical dimensions as you are if you change objective physical reality. Possibly a great example of that, of how innovation and marketing are the same thing, is a product developed as a cold and flu remedy in the 1970s in my childhood, which was a brilliant, brilliant flu treatment with one problem: it sent people fast asleep. And so not very good for drivers, taxi drivers, that sort of thing. And they were flummoxed, and then a marketing person came in and said, but if you position it as a nighttime cold and flu remedy, the fact that it sends you to sleep isn't a problem, it's an advantage. And they created Night Nurse, and it became the most successful cold and flu remedy of the decade. That's reframing. Perfectly content, and as von Mises would give that as a brilliant example of sweeping the floor rather than just cooking the food. If you create the context in which things are perceived and enjoyed, you are creating value every bit as worthwhile and as important as if you're actually making a physical thing. It takes a bit of time to grasp that because we all have tangibility bias. We think that real things are good and perceptual things are dodgy. Why? Something's worth what we're willing to pay for it. And that's a whole mixture of what the thing is, what the context is, and the game theoretic environment in which we buy it. I don't have a problem. It just requires you, in terms of fighting back, if you learn some of these other sciences, you can actually fight back against the dominant and often misguided excessive power of finance within organizations. Thanks very much indeed. Questions or?
I was just going to ask Matt.
Let anybody go who needs to go.
Yeah. Matt, have we got about 10 minutes for questions? Yeah? If people want to bolt...
Yeah, good, for goodness sake.
Bolt.
I don't want to make you late for your competing agencies.
But yeah, we've got about 10 minutes for some questions. So anybody want to shout something out?
Rory,
Yeah.
so how do you propose to make science and art friends?
What it is very simply is that actually these are sciences. Anthropology is a science, behavioral economics is a science. It's a science in that you do empirical experiments and build up a body of knowledge on a framework of theory. And if you read, for example, a book called by Bob Cialdini called Persuasion, he points out there are certain universals to successful persuasive techniques. There are lots of specifics, but there are some common universals. A science, what really distinguishes a science is you're better at it next year than you were last year. And there's no reason why we can't do that. What we can't be, and what we shouldn't aspire to be because it's completely wrong-headed, is the kind of science where you go surface area of a cone, 3.1, tick. It's never going to be that simple, and if you pretend it is, you're actually getting it wrong. And Max Planck, who is the originator, just to understand the distinction between complex systems and simple systems. The simplest complex system, if you see what I mean, you know those brass balls that go round and round on a steam engine? It's called a centrifugal regulator, and it stops the engine going too fast, because as the engine goes faster, the balls pull outwards and release steam, I think, to slow the engine back down again, so it reaches a kind of equilibrium. That's a feedback device in cybernetic terms, okay? And in order to model that, and to describe that mathematically, it took a guy called Clerk Maxwell, who was probably the greatest mathematician of the 19th century, and the mathematical models he produced were so complicated it was another 40 years before computational techniques made them actually usable. Okay. Now, Max Planck, who was a brilliant, the originator of quantum theory, he had a friend who was an economist who said, why did you become an economist, Max? You know, you go to conferences, there's money in it. And he replied very interestingly. He said, no, I couldn't be an economist. He said, the maths is too difficult. Now, Max Planck could have mastered the mathematics of neoclassical economics in an afternoon while pissed standing on his head. I mean, you know, absolutely no problem at all. Okay? Well, the point he made is that if you really want to understand human behavior as it is, rather than as economists pretend it is, it's a completely different game. And so we have to understand that the people who are our friends are the scientists in complexity theory, evolutionary theory. There's a whole load of stuff going on which uses complex modeling. We have friends in game theory. We just don't have many friends in neoclassical economics. Why? Because to make the model neat, they pretend that psychology has no effect on behavior. They pretend that everybody behaves like some sort of calculating automaton. Incidentally, by the way, if everybody did behave like that, society would collapse. Just a very interesting point on which to end, which is consumers can't choose rationally, or it isn't in their interest to choose rationally. And you're going, that's a bloody weird thing to say. If we actually all chose our cars, not by brand value and image and a few other, you know, proxies, but we chose them on how economical they were, what would happen is if you have a single metric which determines success, actually it causes complete economic collapse, because then all that happens is car manufacturers game the metric and they start producing cars which are very, very economical but dangerous, ugly, uncomfortable, rubbish to drive. So we have to choose irrationally in order to make sure that the people who produce cars for us produce cars with a complex mesh of good qualities rather than just one or two. Do you see what I'm saying? That in game theoretic terms, once you have a single metric on which you're judged, it's actually a disaster. So the National Health Service judges emergency rooms on the amount of time a patient has to wait before they're seen by a doctor. Okay? Seems perfectly rational, doesn't it, in some level? Although I would argue no, because it depends whether the person waiting is just pissed and has fallen over or has an actually urgent condition. So even then it's not a very good measure. But it's even worse because you can game it. You cheat. So what they do is they leave you in the ambulance for half an hour out on the hospital drive, because while you're still in the ambulance you haven't been admitted, and so their admission time looks much shorter. That's why when you ring the GP you can't get an appointment for tomorrow. They always say ring back at 8 a.m. Do you get the same thing? And the reason is they're judged by the number of patients they see on the day the appointment was requested. Well, if you can't request an appointment for tomorrow, that figure's 100%. Well done, GP, have a bonus. The fact that it's a total pain in the arse to anybody with a job doesn't enter into it. But then the GP metrics are, again, very bad examples of psychophysics. You know, there hasn't been a single GP who offers house calls since the arrest of Harold Shipman, for example. They aren't really actually incentivized to do the things that people value. And what they are is a lot of these metrics are very, very bad proxies for what consumers actually value. And so the reason we use brands is that brands are a great piece of data compression. Lots and lots of the qualities of a particular thing and manufacturer and trust and social proof are all basically melded, compounded together in this one thing which we can use as an aid in choice. And it works, markets work better that way. Arguably, B2B purchasing is actually worse than consumer purchasing in terms of actually driving progress and useful innovation, because business processing isn't subjective enough. Work on that one. Okay, thanks.
All right, one more.
Two more, go on then.
Well, I think your NHS example shows why innovation is important. I mean, it was famously Tony Blair who was caught out on that in Q&A in the 2003 election, where he didn't realise that actually people game the system. And the reason they do that is because there's not enough innovation in healthcare. If there were more innovation in healthcare, then you wouldn't need to...
And the reason is that the consumer isn't, the Austrians believe that the reason capitalism works is because ultimately the consumer is paramount. And if you try and create proxies for what consumer value is, then what people chase is the proxies, they don't chase the value. And you're much more likely to come up with an interesting innovation in terms of what people will do and what they want than you are. The other thing, metrics actually tend to freeze you in a sort of stasis. I mean, if you think about it, one of the most important things that doctors could do is do some sort of yield management. In other words, if you have a job, they should reserve appointments for you at 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, okay? And if you're retired, they should say retired people have to go during the day, in the middle of the day. There are loads of ways where if you had a proper incentive system.
More innovation, more productivity, if you can apply those terms to healthcare, floats every boat, gives you more opportunity.
Yes, it does.
Now, your point about marketing versus innovation, Marx observed that the cost of production of something versus its exchange value is different, which is where profit.
Well, Marx still believed in the labour theory of value, though, didn't he?
And the reasons for that are multifarious. When you want to buy something, has an effect on its value to you.
Yes.
Marketing has an effect too. But just to do finally just a reductio ad absurdum for you, if marketing really is a proxy for innovation, if we went back to the Stone Age, could we market ourselves into the kind of present that we want?
You can go back further than that. Marketing actually drives innovation in nature, right? This is going to weird you out, okay? Just for a second, okay?
Category error.
No. Just be prepared to be weird here. How on earth did birds invent wings? Because they patently didn't go from no wing to wing, right? Well, some birds developed enormous tails, like the peacock. Nothing to do with natural selection, it's sexual selection. It's an advertisement that game theoretically says to a female peahen, hey, I must be a pretty damn cool peacock because I can carry around this huge decorative thing on my back, which you use as a proxy for genetic fitness in deciding which peacock to have sex with. Because in nature, women generally do the choosing. And in humanity, true. I don't know if you've noticed that. I mean, generally, you can try this in reverse, but it'll lead to very strange reactions. Do you get my point? In fact, by and large, game theoretically, most blokes, if propositioned by a woman, very directly assume she's a loony. Fair? I mean, you may take advantage of it, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that game theoretically, there's a whole load of stuff going on in that thing. But I'll park this for a second. Now, interestingly, some birds develop plumage, it's an exaption, for temperature control, and then they became used for sexual display or for advertisement on the arms. And so, in some ways, sexual selection, which is marketing in nature, it's how you advertise your genetic fitness to the opposite sex, okay, is actually how the major innovations happen. Because there's no use to a very stubby wing in survival terms, but in sexual selection terms, wings get bigger and bigger until you then discover you can glide with them and then fly with them. So the big leaps in Darwinian evolution happen through sexual selection, including, by the way, the human brain, which most people believe is actually there as for purposes of, because it's difficult to be intelligent in genetic terms, you don't need a vocabulary of 20,000, 40,000 words to chase elephants. You just need a few words like behind you, arg, and ah, okay? It's not that complicated. The reason we develop language, it's widely believed, is actually sexual selection as a sort of proxy to demonstrate your genetic fitness in the form of mental lucidity, okay? So actually, human intelligence did not evolve so we could invent jet engines. It evolved so we could pick up chicks, okay? And then later on was used to make jet engines. Is that too weird? But when I say this, okay, this isn't me just going bonkers. Serious geneticists.
The area you just described in your talk, you're mapping biology onto human society.
Well, it's a reasonable thing to do, isn't it?
You've just criticised economists who try and...
But no. Darwinian economists, and there are Darwinian economists, are complexity economists, in fairness, because they recognise that, for example, there are runaway signalling effects like the peacock's tail. So neoclassical economists don't. In fact, Thorstein Veblen wrote a paper in the 19th century, which is "Why isn't economics an evolutionary science?" And his whole rant, as is the rant of some present-day people, Paul Ormerod, for example, who uses modelling of ecosystems to describe economic activity in economic sectors. So I'll give you an interesting example where you can. I'm perfectly cool about that. I mean, I think it's neoclassical economics, which is dubious, but actually Darwinian economics. A book by Robert Frank called The Darwin Economy is one of the best books on economics I've ever read. And I really recommend this as a really interesting way to understand things like luxury goods consumer behaviour in Darwinian terms. It's equivalent to a kind of peacock's tail. And there are things like costly signaling theory, again, which is generally used to understand both, sexual selection in animals. So I've got absolutely no beef in mapping economic ecosystems and animal and plant ecosystems and looking for commonalities between the two. I think that's a great thing to do. I mean, here's an interesting one, okay? One of the things that bad Darwinism causes people to do is overestimate the value of just competition, direct competition. And if you look at most animal species, not many of them compete. Only 5% of mammals are carnivorous to start with. And the reason you get so much of a diversity of species is so they can avoid competing with each other for the same thing. So if one bird can take nectar from this flower and another bird can have nectar from another flower, the two don't come into competition. Now, bad people who half understand Darwin would say, no, it all works through competition and survival of the fittest. Now, okay, let's look at two different ecosystems here. One of them is British grocery retailing, okay, where they have diversified brilliantly. So you basically have Harrods Food Hall and Selfridges Food Hall. I guess it goes M&S, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, then a broad band of Tesco, Tesco's Finest, Tesco's Standard, Tesco's Value, then you have Asda, and then you have Lidl, right? And all of you, I think, could roughly rank those things like that. And so to a great extent, these two don't compete with each other. They sort of do in a weird way, in that you've got to look at not just target markets, but target moments. So, poorer people who want a special occasion will go to M&S, richer people who actually just want to feel a bit smart will go to Lidl. But they're not in direct competition, okay? And I think it works beautifully. I think it's the Galapagos Islands of an economy. This thing is the mobile phone industry, where there's no real differentiation. There isn't a Lidl of mobile telephony for my kids who just text each other and talk shit. I just want a cheap, low-quality mobile phone network, and a kind of M&S of mobile phones where you pay more for your phone calls. The regulator, and to some extent the city, by imposing the same metrics on all four players, has created this horrible kind of red in tooth and claw ecosystem where all four of them compete for exactly the same customer base. The quality now of the UK mobile phone networks is total shit. Does anybody agree? Yeah. I mean, it's getting worse. We're spending all this money, and I cannot drive on the M25 and make a phone call with the confident expectation. It's Europe's busiest fucking motorway. And I can't drive on the M25 without the expectation that I'll hit a black spot about every 5 or 10 miles. I'm sorry, that's shit, okay? And the reason is that bad people who think it's all about competing for the same space and driving down prices have created this kind of crap ecosystem where it's a kind of fight to the death and a race to the bottom. Whereas this ecosystem, I mean, that's beautiful, isn't it? I mean, it's not often people say that, but you know what I mean? I mean, by the way, nobody ever says this because Brits never say anything good about ourselves, but I spent sort of 3 or 4 weeks in the US. And interestingly, the two things you're really glad to come home to are the British grocery retail environment, Ocado, all the choice and stuff you have. By the way, good quality food in the UK is much cheaper in the US. You can get good quality food in Los Angeles. It costs a fucking fortune. Whole Foods is known as whole paycheck. And the American creative director came over to work on Unilever in Ogilvy, and he said, I was very impressed by Waitrose. He said, the food's so good and so reasonable. He's come from Los Angeles, okay? That's a messed up ecosystem in the States where you either have very cheap total shit or pay a fortune. This is actually quite beautiful. The other thing I'm glad to get back to is the other thing. Can I really scandalise you with a reframing? I actually think that Rupert Murdoch's just as great a guy as Steve Jobs. That's how to really offend, okay? Really offend the creative community. Let me just explain. For all his many faults, and he's not a nasty bloke, although he's nicer to his kids than Steve Jobs was. Let's be absolutely fair about that, okay? All right? Which is, basic pattern of human decency. You're quite nice to your kids. Both of them are completely unreasonable men, okay? I'm not disputing that. But actually, the ecosystem for TV that Murdoch created in the UK involved 2 absolutely massive risks. First of all, on satellite. Secondly, on digital satellite. And I came back from Los Angeles, 10 days in Los Angeles, which is the entertainment capital of the world, and I can't wait to get back to my skybox. So let's not diss the guy entirely, okay? Because I think if you're dispassionate, we tend to have framing effects where we like to have good guys and bad guys. We like a kind of binary world. I'm just saying that, no, both of them are shit. Okay, let's be, if you're a client of ours, so I better be a bit careful there. Don't film me. But nonetheless, in terms of their technological achievement, I don't think there's much of a fag paper between them, actually. Sorry, nobody agrees with me, do you? Anybody? There must be one person. No,
on that point
I've
of
lost.
non-agreement, we're going to have
Okay.
time to Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Pleasure, as
Rory.
ever. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.